Victorian Premier. Out of control. He's a menace to his state. He's a menace to his country. He is destroying Victoria's economy, destroying jobs, destroying the federal finances, and I really fear that it's so bad that he will now provoke civil unrest, much worse than what we saw on the weekend, with even grandmothers arrested for breaking his draconian stay-home rules. And today, virus experts, business leaders and the Morrison government are publicly asking, what the hell is Daniel Andrews up to? Why did he yesterday announce that Victoria, with just 41 new infections today, why Victoria will still stay under the world's toughest lockdown for at least 2 more months? A curfew, stay-at-home rules, visitors banned, shops shut, and hundreds of thousands of people banned from working, many going broke or in utter despair. And I sure can understand the anger of so many people at hearing this yesterday. I share it. The Victorian Premier seems utterly delusional. I find it frightening. He's now babbling about how a supercomputer told him to extend this terrible lockdown and how there was no other choice. How often he said that. No other choice, which is an obvious falsehood.
More than 1,000 different scenarios have been put into this supercomputer. You can't argue with this sort of data. You can't argue with science. You can't do anything but follow the best health advice.
You can't argue with this data, with this science, he says, but in fact that's exactly what we must argue with. His science, because it is bull. If the best data, the best medical advice and the best science and a supercomputer are telling Andrews to keep the shutdown going for at least 2 more months, why is he the only premier in Australia with these kinds of bans? What's more, why is he the only leader in the whole Western world with bans this incredibly tough? No American state is locked down like Victoria. Italy isn't. France isn't. Britain isn't. Countries with more infections than Victoria and states and countries with fewer infections than Victoria, none of them think bans like this today are useful or proportionate. Only Dan Andrews. Wonder what these voices in his ear really are. Only his Victoria has a lockdown so tough that Daniel Andrews says he will not lift the curfew, the stay-home law and the bans on shops until October 26, 2 months from now. And then he will do it only if new infections are down to an average of just 5 a day, over 2 weeks. The Prime Minister today was saying, what? By that measure, under Daniel Andrews' rules for Victoria, New South Wales today will be shut down right now, under a curfew, shops shut, the whole thing. How on earth did Daniel Andrews come up with these rules?
We're yet still to receive the detailed modelling. We've seen the high-level modelling and the other assumptions that have gone into the plan. But what I can't help but be struck by is that under the thresholds that have been set in that plan, Sydney would be under curfew now. Sydney doesn't need to be under curfew now. They have a tracing capability that can deal with outbreaks.
In fact, Daniel Andrews is so obsessed, so manic. I've never seen anything like this in Australian politics. So manic that he says he won't even let most shops in Victoria open until November 23, 3 months away. And then he won't even let them open unless there are 0 infections in the state for 2 weeks. 0 infections. Let me explain how nuts that is, how delusional. Even Queensland right now would have its retail shops shut if Daniel Andrews was Premier there imposing his rules. How he loves that word, his rules. It's had infections over the past fortnight. Even Western Australia would have its shops shut right now. I tell you, this is lunacy, and it's happening right in front of our eyes by a Premier in charge of Australia's second biggest state. What he's doing to Victoria, the cost will be shared among all Australians. And what's this babbling about no option but to do this? There are options, because the other states are taking those options, those other options, and thank God, you will say, if you live there. But here's Andrews. My supercomputer says no, says stop. My modelling says keep the economy shut. Well, does it really? Or is this another case of garbage in a computer, garbage out? Because a lot of epidemiologists today were saying this modelling says what exactly?
So there's very little detail of the modelling that was presented yesterday, and I think that was probably disappointing.
Professor Catherine Bennett, same reaction. She's epidemiology chair at Deakin University. She says this modelling that Andrews has got and is not releasing won't show us what's behind it, all the assumptions. It seems based on overseas data, which may not actually be relevant here. And she said she's seen absolutely no evidence here that's been any analysis of Victoria's data, which surely is what we need. And she wonders, is this extended lockdown really the smartest way ahead that gives us the public health protection we want, but also gives us as much opening as possible? In fact, nearly 600 leading doctors, surgeons and professors of medicine have said exactly the same in a letter to the Premier. They say there is another way. These bans must go because they are causing more harm than good by locking up the healthy when more should be done to trace the infectious and protect the old, who are in fact actually and almost exclusively most likely to die. Which brings me to the Premier's mystery supercomputer. It turns out that this factor is exactly what this supercomputer was asked not to calculate. It was not asked to calculate, hey, gosh, what would happen if the Victorian government simply did its job properly, like every other state? Would Victoria really need these lockdowns? Hear this from one of the experts who actually did the modelling for the Andrews government. Professor Tony Blakely is an epidemiologist from Melbourne University, and even he now admits if Victorians do our contact tracing better than we did 3 months ago, the contact tracers may be able to hold the case count without it going up again as badly as our model suggests. Did you get that? If they simply did the contact tracing as well as it's done in New South Wales, maybe the numbers wouldn't go up if there was a lifting of the bans. Oh, and he said, oh, one other thing, better infection control in aged care homes and hospitals. Yep, that would help too. Haven't we been screaming for just that? In fact, it was only last week, the Victorian government was finally advertising for a huge contract for computer services to help it with that contact tracing of people who might be infected. That was just last week. What has the government been doing for these months and months and months? No wonder the Prime Minister today came to exactly the same conclusion. Why didn't Daniel Andrews and his sorry government, his gang of 8, the 8 ministers is handpicked to do it, all the other ministers frozen out, why didn't it just do the basics correctly? Better contact tracing above all, rather than hit Victoria with the worst shutdown in the world. And he hinted, shutting down Victoria like this was so damaging and so unnecessary that the federal government would now think very hard before helping to bail out the state, to help it cope with the consequences of what Daniel Andrews had visited on it. He wouldn't even commit to keeping job payments going at this level for Victoria.
I'll be looking to see what they'll be doing first before the Commonwealth considers any responses that we'll be making.
And I don't blame him. Why should the rest of Australia, why should you in New South Wales or you in South Australia or in Queensland, wherever, why should you have to pay $1 to bail out a state ruined by a Premier who seems a megalomaniac, imposing ruinous bans, world's worst bans, and journalists here clapping, oh yes, Dan's our man. Not all of them, of course. You should hear the ABC though, and some people on 3AW. Well, let them pay the consequences. But that doesn't stop me from worrying about so much else. I worry for the people who are hanging on to their businesses by their fingertips and now tell me, that's it, they're finished. They can't last another 3 months. I worry for the hundreds of thousands of fellow Victorians who have already been thrown out of work, and the many more who will now follow. I'm hearing from them. People are contacting me. I worry about the people shut in their homes, the lonely, the unemployed, the mentally ill, and women shut in with a domestic abuser. And there's another thing I worry about. Even a Premier like Dan Andrews, dictatorial, ultimately rules by consent. When more Victorians feel this man is actually out of their control, he's cancelled Parliament once already, he rules under a state of emergency that lets his police do God knows what, some people will get desperate. Now, I do not condone it. I do not wish it. Obey the law even if you disagree with it. But I do already notice the protests against these bans and the increasing police aggression that is needed to subdue them. We saw it with police last week, arresting even a pregnant mum in her pyjamas in front of her children, simply for advertising a protest in Ballarat. We saw it again when police smashed down the door of a man who posted that he might go check out a protest in Melbourne on the weekend against the bans. And we saw it when police then shut down that protest. And when they not only moved to charge a grandmother sitting on a park bench, but then quickly snatched away a phone out of the hand of a companion who was filming them. By what right do they do that even? Police also gang tackled a journalist from Rebel Media covering the protest.
I am media. I'm media. I've got my permit in my pocket. My permit is in my pocket. I'm fine. I've got my permit in my pocket. I work for Rebel News. I am lawfully here.
And now my wife sends me a picture of police patrolling our local park. We saw them the other day, warning a guy that was there kicking a footy in the open air. It's just so crazy. These scenes in Victoria, the oppression, this willful destruction of a modern economy, the rank incompetence, the damage and the hurt, and justified by a Premier who hears the voice of a computer and says, I had no option. But he did. He does. But somehow he cannot see it, will not see it, will not take it. So how will this disaster end?